Hello there. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that you are watching this video. So this is the third video in our series of videos for Chapter 8. And in this one, we are going to enter into subtopic 8.3. So let's just have a quick recap of what we've gone through in Chapter 8 so far. So in 8.1, we talked about the transport system in the human body, which involves the mammalian heart. Okay, so we talk about the mammalian heart, how oxygen goes in, carbon dioxide goes out, blah, 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 blah. And then we also talk about transport that involves the lymphatic system. So, yang melibatkan kita punya sistem limpa. Dan sekarang, today, we are going to go into the transport system, which is in plants. The subtopics in this subtopic is going to be about, first of all, we're going to talk about the water pathway from soil to roots. How water goes from soil into the akar. And then once it's already in the roots, how the water will travel up the xylem from the roots to the rest of the plants. And in the process, we will also discuss the uptake of mineral ions in roots. Aside from that, it's not just xylem in the plant, right? There's also phloem. So we will talk about how substances are transported in the phloem using the pressure flow hypothesis. The learning objectives, or what I expect you to be able to learn by the end of this video and this subtopic, is that you should be able to describe the pathway which water is transported, how water moves via the xylem, how the mineral ion uptake in roots is done via active transport and fusion, and also you should be able to describe the pressure flow hypothesis, which is in the phloem. Okay, let's get going to the next slide. So any transport system in plants is going to involve these two tissues. The two tissues that we're talking about is xylem and phloem. The function of the xylem is to transport water and minerals, and its transport is in one direction only, from bottom to above. Memang dari bawah ke atas. And there are two types of water conducting cells, which are trachete and vessel elements. Whereas for phloem will transport organic and inorganic solutes. So the transport direction is in two ways. It can be from middle to up or middle down. There are two types of cells that are present in the phloem tissue, which are the sieve tube and the companion cells. So when we look at transport of water in plants, it's going to start from the root and to the leaves and also all the other shoots and other parts of the plants. And if you are ready, let us begin underground. So underground, we will find the roots, and if you cut the root cross section, you will find it looking like this. You have the xylem and the phloem in the middle, and then around that is the cortex. Cortex adalah bahagian ni yang kita boleh anggap macam isi tumbuhan where all the other plant cells are. And then you have the epidermis, or the skin, the kulit of the plant, and these root hairs. Root hairs are those cells in the epidermis that extend its cytoplasm. Okay, root hair is basically a plant cell that made part of itself long so that it can increase its surface area and absorb more water and mineral ions. Now, we won't be using this diagram when we are learning about transport in root. We will be using this diagram down here. So, nanti kita akan banyak menggunakan diagram ni untuk memahami proses-proses yang ada pada akar. Okay, so if you look here, this is the root hair. Jangan dulu kamu tengok dia punya laluan-laluan tu. Don't focus on the roots yet. We'll do that in the next slide. Here, you just have a look at the root hair. This one layer of cell is called the epidermis. This isi is called the cortex. After that, we have the endodermis, lapisan dalam. The endodermis is colored in orange, and it has this thing called Casparian strip in its cell wall. After endodermis, dalam lagi daripada endodermis adalah stele, S-T-E-L-E. And stele is consisting of all the vascular bundles, the xylem, the phloem, and everything. Okay, so let's have a look at the pathway of water transport in plants. There are three pathways that are used by water to move from one cell to another when it enters the plant. The first is the apoplastic pathway, which is when water and mineral ions travels along the cell wall and extracellular space. So air itu dia akan menyisip-nyisip, dia masuk dan melalui cell wall, tidak masuk cytoplasm. The second is the symplastic pathway. The water and ions travel across the cytosol and plasmodesmata. Means dia akan masuk plasma membrane dalam sel yang pertama. Lepas tu dia akan bergerak melalui cytoplasm. Bila dia sampai di penghujung satu sel, dia akan melalui plasmodesmata untuk pergi ke sel yang seterusnya. The third pathway is the vacuolar pathway. So this is moving from vacuole to vacuole. Water and mineral ions will move from vacuole to vacuole through neighboring cells, crossing the cytoplasm and tonoplast. So dia merentasi cytoplasm. Tonoplast is the layer that is protecting the vacuole. So daripada cytoplasm kepada tonoplast, ke dalam vacuole, kepada tonoplast untuk keluar, kepada cytoplasm, and so on and so on. So we'll just have a quick review at those three pathways again. Let's look at those pathways. Symplastic pathway is like this. Dia masuk ke dalam cytoplasm dan melalui cytoplasm sahaja. Vacuolar is like this. Dia masuk dari satu vacuole, dia pergi kepada vacuole yang seterusnya, dan dia akan melalui banyak membrane. The third pathway is like this, apoplastic. It just goes in the cell wall and extracellular space. Okay, let us move on to the next lesson. Alright, now that we know the three main pathways of water movement in plants, we can then learn about the pathway by which water is transported from the surrounding soil to the root vascular system. Dalam erti kata lain, kita boleh tengok macam mana air bergerak daripada tanah masuk ke dalam xylem. And we will be using this diagram as a reference and also for you to learn. We'll start by saying that the absorbing region of the roots will have root hairs. Part akar yang berfungsi untuk menyerap air, dia akan ada root hair, which is distinct. Root hairs will increase the surface area of the root. The cell sap in the root cell vacuoles will contain high concentration of dissolved nutrients. What this means is water potential in the root will be lower than water potential of the soil. Hence, water is drawn by osmosis from soil into the root hairs. The movement of water via osmosis is from soil into root hair. Now, the water potential in the root hairs will increase. What's going to happen next is water will diffuse by osmosis to the cortex. So, movement of water is now from root hair into the cortex. Water will go through the cortex via apoplastic, symplastic, and vacuolar pathway. Dia ikut itu tiga pathway yang kita belajar tadi. So, this apoplastic pathway will look like this. In the apoplastic pathway, water moves along the cell wall or extracellular spaces. At the endodermis, the apoplastic pathway is hindered by the Casparian strip. Hindered means dia terhalang atau diganggu oleh Casparian strip. Water and minerals cannot cross the endodermis and enter the stele. Stele is the vascular bundle ataupun xylem phloem. Water and minerals cannot cross the endodermis and enter the stele via apoplastic pathways because of the presence of Casparian strip. Air dengan mineral tidak boleh limpas melalui cell wall sebab ada ini Casparian strip. What's the Casparian strip? It is this purple thing that you see in the diagram. It's present in the endodermis. It is a belt made of suberin. Suberin is a waxy material, wax, macam lilin, that is impermeable to water and dissolved minerals. Water and dissolved minerals tidak boleh limpas suberin. So, these water and minerals will have to cross the plasma membrane of an endodermal cell and undergo symplastic or vacuolar pathways before they can enter the stele. Dia mesti masuk plasma membrane juga, tidak boleh sisip-sisip di luar. So water movement will then continue via the symplastic and the vacuolar pathway. Dia akan ikut anak panah hitam ni via the symplastic and vacuolar pathway. In the symplastic pathway, water moves through cytoplasm of adjacent cells through plasmodesmata. So here I have this green arrow. I'll show you again, showing the symplastic pathway. In the vacuolar pathway, water moves through the vacuoles via osmosis. As you can see in this green diagram over here, it's going to pass through the vacuoles and the other membranes via osmosis. The movement of water via symplastic and vacuolar pathways will continue until it reaches the xylem. Kalau dari mula dia adalah symplastic ataupun vacuolar pathway, dia memang terus saja sampai ke xylem. Kalau dia mula sebagai apoplastic pathway, bila dia sampai Casparian strip, dia mesti berhenti dan bergabung dengan pathway 2 yang lain. Okay, so just a quick summary of how water moves from soil to the xylem. We start with the soil. Water moves via osmosis into root hairs. From root hairs, move via osmosis into epidermis. From epidermis, move via osmosis into root cortex. From root cortex into the endodermis, it can move via apoplastic, symplastic, and vacuolar pathway. From the endodermis into the xylem, water can only move via the symplastic and the vacuolar pathway. So I hope that's a bit clear. If not, maybe you have to have a look at the diagram and the animations again, or you can ask me questions later. All right. Now we are moving on to the next topic, basically. Now the water is already in the xylem. Now we want to see how the water in the xylem move to the rest of the plants. So we can explain the water movement in the xylem with two theories. So we can say that water movement via xylem by pulling the xylem sap. Sap adalah getah, you know, the stuff that is in the plant if you try to cut it. By pulling the xylem sap using a mechanism called transpiration cohesion tension mechanism. The second explanation is by pushing the xylem sap using root pressure. Let us look at this one by one. We're going to start with the first one, pulling xylem sap. So this first explanation, this first theory, is related to transpiration. Transpiration is the process of losing water through the evaporation of water from leaf surface. Ini kamu pernah belajar di sekolah kan dulu. Plants will do transpiration. It's gonna release water vapor from its leaves. So here water will exit the plant through the stomata in the leaves. Bila sel yang paling dekat dengan stomata ini kehilangan air, dia akan cari air, dia minta air daripada sel-sel di sebelah. So yang akan bagi dia air adalah xylem. Water from xylem will flow out to replace the water that is in the mesophyll layer. Bila air ini kena tarik, air daripada xylem di daun ini kena tarik, air yang ada pada xylem di belakang daun itu pun akan ikut tertarik. Okay? When water comes out from the xylem into the surrounding cell, the rest of the water that is in the xylem will be pulled up. Bila ini naik, kawan dia yang di bawah pun ikut tertarik ke atas. Dan ditarik, dan ditarik, dan ditarik. So, ini yang akan, inilah mekanisme dia. Daripada daun, daripada stomata, ada transpiration. Air di belakang dia akan ikut ditarik ke atas, ikut ditarik ke atas, ikut ditarik ke atas. And it's gonna pull more water out from the soil. Okay, itu tadi adalah explanation secara ringkas, belum guna keyword lagi. Sekarang kita tengok explanation yang gunakan ayat yang cantik. Okay, I'm going to start with the proper sentences, okay? Kita mau start explain guna dengan ayat ini. Water evaporates from the walls of the spongy mesophyll and the air in the intercellular space becomes saturated with water. the air outside the stomata is not saturated with water. Dia punya pergerakan macam ni. So water will diffuse from region of higher water potential, which is the intercellular space, that empty space in the leaves, to a region of lower water potential, which is the air outside. Water will move out of the xylem and into the spongy mesophyll cells. Sebab tadi spongy mesophyll cells kehilangan air. Sekarang air daripada xylem masuk untuk menggantikan air yang ada di spongy mesophyll cell. As molecules of water are removed from the xylem, more water molecules are pulled up to replace them. So tadi xylem di daun, kekurangan air sudah. Air daripada bahagian lain, bahagian xylem lain akan ditarik naik untuk menggantikannya. So this pulling force, where it is being pulled, is called the transpiration pull. The flow of water through the xylem will rely on two important properties of water. How is it able to pull the water? Because water has this property of cohesion. Ini daripada chapter 1 lagi yang kita belajar sem lepas. Cohesion is when water molecules are strongly attracted to one another by hydrogen bonding. Kalau kamu tengok di diagram sebelah sini, that cohesion is what I color as the yellow thing. Okay, so tengok lagi. Yellow part. That yellow part. That is cohesion between water molecules. Dia macam water molecule itu berpegang tangan dan susah mau lepaskan diorang bila diorang berpegang tangan. Kalau kamu dengan kawan kamu berpegang tangan, kawan kamu start berlari, kamu pun terikut berlari kan? So that is what happens to the water molecules. Disebabkan cohesion, dia akan ikut kawan dia. Another property of water that allows it to flow in the xylem is adhesion. Adhesion is addition of water to the wall of xylem cells by hydrogen bonding. Macam mana dia boleh lawan gravity? Sebab dia ada adhesion. Untuk membolehkan dia melekat kepada xylem punya sel. Dia tidak terjatuh ikut gravity. So the upward pulling of water is only possible as long as there is an unbroken column of water in the xylem throughout the plant. Tidak boleh ada air bubble or anything in the middle. The cohesive and adhesive properties of water enable it to form a continuous column that can be pulled up through the xylem. Ya, sebab ciri-ciri air memang begitu, memang dia senang untuk form a continuous column, dia tidak akan mudah terputus dan dia boleh form a continuous chain, continuous column from the soil to the tips of the plants. That is pretty much what is the xylem, pulling xylem sap explanation. Okay, so kalau kamu mau tulis essay, kamu perlu explain macam mana transpiration, cohesion, tension mechanism. Kamu rujuk balik slide-slide ini. Okay, now we are going into the second explanation. The second explanation talks about pushing the xylem sap using root pressure. So, tadi itu transpiration yang berlaku pada waktu siang. Pada waktu malam, kita tiada transpiration. At night, there is low or no transpiration. So, the root cells will still continue to pump mineral ions into the xylem, as shown in this purple arrow. Mineral ions goes in there. Then you will have accumulation of mineral ions, which lower the potential in the xylem. Disebabkan akar masih ambil pump mineral ion ke dalam akar, pump mineral ion masuk ke dalam xylem, water potential of the xylem will be low. So, water will flow in from the root cortex, generating a root pressure, a push of xylem sap. All the water is going in, and makin ramai di bawah, dia akan makin tolak, makin tolak, makin tolak, makin tolak sampai ke atas. This is the root pressure. Makin banyak air masuk, dia akan tolak, 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 tolak. Root pressure. However, the magnitude of the pressure is usually low and not enough to push water to the top of a tree. If it's like a very short plant, maybe it's enough. But if you have plants that are over 1 meter tall, remember in our rainforest, we even have something that is more than 40 meters tall. So macam, this root pressure is not enough to push it all the way. The root pressure is only significant in small herbaceous plants in conditions where rates of transpirations are low. If you have a big plant, you will still have a little bit of root pressure, but it's not enough to push it all the way to the top. Root pressure in the small plants can push water all the way up the stem, and sometimes when there is too much root pressure, like tekanan daripada air daripada akar tu kuat sangat, it can force droplets of water out from the edge of the leaves. If you see this, this is a process called guttation. You can see this in some plants in the morning, tapi jangan kelirukan dia dengan embun. Embun, it's gonna be like on the surface, but this guttation is only at the very tip. Di hujung-hujung xylem itulah kamu akan nampak dia. This is guttation. Okay, so I'll just quickly summarize the transport of water in plants. Water in plants is gonna flow from below to above. And how that occurs is, first we explain it using transpiration cohesion tension mechanism. Ataupun kalau kamu lupa nama penuh dia, kamu guna, you mention transpiration and you mention pulling xylem sap. Remember, transpiration cohesion tension mechanism will start with transpiration in the leaves. Transpiration in the leaves creates a pulling force that pulls water up the xylem. The second mechanism is pushing xylem sap using root pressure. So pushing xylem sap or using root pressure will start with mineral ions in the roots. Mineral ions in the roots lowers water potential. That means water keeps flowing in and water will flow up the xylem. The more powerful mechanism to explain transport of water is transpiration cohesion tension mechanism. So yang warna biru ni, yang bermula dengan transpiration ni, ini akan lebih kuat lah dia punya kuasa menggerakkan air dalam xylem tu, berbanding dengan pushing xylem sap using root pressure. Okay, so that's pretty much it for transport of water in plants. Do go back and read the notes and try to do essays on it in your own time. Okay. Okay, mari kita pergi kepada subtopik seterusnya. The next mini subtopic is mineral ion uptake in roots. Dari tadi kita cakap pasal air, sekarang kita cakap pasal nutrien-nutrien lain yang berada dalam bentuk ion. So these mineral ions from the soil will enter through the root hairs either passively or actively. Mineral ions can enter the root hair via diffusion if the concentration is greater outside the root hair than the inside. Kalau memang di luar banyak concentration of that nutrient, dalam akar sikit, dia akan masuk sebagai diffusion. But if the concentration of mineral ions in the soil is lower than inside the root hair, they will enter through active transport. So kalau di tanah, kurang concentration of mineral ion, dalam akar, high concentration of mineral ion, the roots will pump the mineral ion from soil into roots using active transport. Once these mineral ions are already inside the root hairs, the mineral ions may move across the cortex via the apoplastic and symplastic pathway. So dia boleh masuk melalui apoplastic dan symplastic pathway. When it reaches the endodermis, the Casparian strip ensure that dissolved ions need to move across selectively permeable membrane. Casparian strip tidak akan membenarkan mineral ion untuk melalui cell wall. Dia akan paksa mineral ion untuk masuk plasma membrane juga. Mesti ada, macam kita lah, mau limpas sempadan kan, mesti ada swab test. Begitulah. Dia akan paksa mineral ion itu untuk melalui pemilihan across selectively permeable membrane. so that only selected ions will pass into the steel, will pass into the xylem. Kita tidak, itu tumbuhan tidak mau ion-ion yang tidak berguna ikut termasuk. Dia akan pilih ion yang dia mau saja. And this will also prevent solutes from the steel from leaking back into the soil. The Casparian strip, the endodermis, make sure that the ions that are already in the xylem is not going to bocor and go back into the soil. Once it is in the xylem, the minerals are then carried up by transpiration pull. So if I am to show it in this diagram, kamu tengok diagram ni, whoop, whoop, oh, begitu dia naik. Okay, mau tengok lagi animation. Dia punya ion akan masuk melalui selectively permeable membrane. Masuk begitu, bila masuk saja xylem, dia akan ikut air dan bergerak ke atas. After this, the mineral ions will just travel with water through the xylem to the whole plant. So ringkas sajalah mineral ion uptake in roots. Last but not least, we are going to talk about the photosynthetics products, which is in the phloem. Sekarang kita masuk kepada phloem tissue and translocation. Apa benda ni translocation? Translocation is the transport of organic substances such as soluble products and some plant hormones. So, translocation ini boleh untuk products of photosynthesis macam glucose, sucrose, tapi dia boleh juga transport benda lain seperti plant hormones. Plant hormones, nanti belakang kita cerita. Now we only learn about how materials in phloem is transported. So translocation is carried out in the vascular tissue known as the phloem. And this is the diagram that we are going to use to explain translocation. Okay, so first we are going to start with the source and sink. Phloem will translocate its sap from sugar source to sugar sink. Apa benda ni? Sugar source, sugar sink. Phloem sap is anything that is in the phloem, contents of the phloem. It is mostly sugar, such as sucrose. It can contain minerals, it can contain amino acid, it can contain hormones. Sugar source, usually referring to leaves. It is the plant's organ that produce sugar by photosynthesis or breakdown of starch. For in this case, our sugar source is the plant's leaf. Dia akan hasilkan sugar through photosynthesis. So dia adalah sumber, source. Next, we talk about sugar sink. Sugar sink is the plant's organ that will consume or store sugar. So kalau dia fungsi sel itu lebih banyak kepada macam apa? Dia lebih banyak menggunakan sugar daripada menghasilkan sugar, dia boleh dikira sebagai sugar sink. You know, where things go and dia tenggelam. Sink. Sugar sink. And the common example is the root. And it's a logical example as well because things will be produced in the leaves, translocated in the phloem until it reaches the sink known as roots. Okay, so let's try to explain this using leaf as the source and root as the sink. So the leaves, which is the source, carry out photosynthesis and produce sugars. In this case, we are going to use sucrose. And then those sucrose will be pumped by active transport into the companion cells and then into the sieve tubes of the phloem. Okay, so you try to follow the arrows that I have in my animation over here. Okay, so, where was I? All right, I'm continuing. Sucrose will be pumped by active transport into the companion cells and then the sieve tube of the phloem. From there, sugars will accumulate in the phloem. It will be dissolved in water and then reduce the water potential in the phloem. So water potential in the phloem here will be reduced. Kalau water potential kurang, apa yang berlaku adalah air masuk. Water from the xylem will enter the sieve tube via osmosis. So water enters sieve tube via osmosis here. The entry of water will generate a high hydrostatic pressure. So the dissolved sugars will flow from the area to an area with less pressure. So in this case, it's going to flow in this direction. Let's follow it down. Follow it down. As the fluid is pushed down the phloem, sugars are removed by the cortex cells of both stem and root, which is the sink, and will consume or convert it into starch. So bila dia sampai kepada kawasan yang memerlukan gula tu, memerlukan substance tu, the cortex cells of stem or cortex cells of roots will pump those materials into their cells. Okay, so daripada di cortex tu dia akan masuk dalam companion cell dulu. Daripada companion cell, dia akan pass kepada sel-sel yang memerlukan. Sel yang memerlukan itu kita boleh gelar dia sebagai sink. So in this case, it went from leaf all the way down to the root. The root cell is considered the sink. Starch is insoluble and will increase the water potential. So bila dia di sini, dia akan jadi starch, and that means you're gonna have a higher water potential. Higher water potential means water in the phloem will be drawn back via osmosis into nearby xylem vessels by the suction of transpiration pool. Sebab gula yang ada di sini sudah dipindahkan kepada sini ataupun dijadikan sebagai starch, water potential here will be higher than in the xylem, and water molecules from this part of the phloem will flow back into the xylem. And so the conclusion is that the pressure gradient between the source, which is the leaves, and the sink, which is shoots and roots, will drive the contents of the phloem up and down through the sieve tube. Dalam contoh ini saya gunakan source kita daun, sink kita akar. Tapi sink boleh juga menjadi pucuk-pucuk daun. So the shoots of the plants can also be the sinks, because bila dia baru start bertumbuh tu kan dia akan banyak menggunakan gula, tapi dia tidak berapa buat banyak photosynthesis. So in the beginning, when the shoots are still young, they are going to be sinks. But as it grows and once it is able to produce leaves, the old shoots become leaf will become new source. So the source and the sink in the plants can change from time to time. Benda lain yang boleh dijadikan sebagai sink selain daripada sel-sel di akar dan sel-sel di pucuk, sel-sel di buah-buahan dan di bunga pun boleh jadi sink. As long as that thing is producing more sugar than it uses, it is source. If that thing is consuming more sugar than it produces, it is sink. Okay, so that's just a tidbit of information in case you are confused kenapa sekejap dia cakap up, sekejap dia cakap down. Okay. Alright, oh sorry, I was going to show you this animation. So yeah, that is the animation, that is how things happen, that is the flow from the source to the sink. And then water goes back into xylem. Okay, so itu saja untuk translocation in phloem. Sekarang kita buat satu rumusan untuk subtopic ni. We have a quick summary of 8.3. So in 8.3, we talk about how water is taken up from the soil into the root cells and then into the xylem. So that occurs in the absorptive part akar yang akan menyerap air. Dia akan menyerap air melalui root hairs, lepas tu dia akan daripada root hairs masuk epidermis kepada cortex, daripada cortex kepada endodermis, dari endodermis masuk kepada stele ataupun xylem. Once it is in the xylem, what makes the water travel up the plant is number 1, transpiration pool, and number 2, root pressure. Okay, so transpiration pool, when the plant transpires, it's gonna create a transpiration pool that will force water up the xylem. Root pressure means water will be pushed from the root up. We also talked about how mineral ions are taken up into the roots. So mineral ions can be taken up into the roots via diffusion, or it can come into the roots via active transport. After that, it will enter into the xylem and it will move together with water up to the rest of the plants. The products of photosynthesis and other materials can be transported through the phloem. So in this case, we look at the source, which are the leaves. Products of photosynthesis, such as sucrose, will be transported down to the roots, which are the sinks, or it can be transported up to other sinks, such as the growing shoots or fruits. Okay, so transport yang kita cakap dalam tumbuh-tumbuhan merangkumi air, mineral ion, dan juga products of photosynthesis such as glucose and sucrose. Itu sajalah ringkasan untuk subtopik ini. So that is the end of chapter 8. Now that we're done, it's time for you to come up with your own notes for this chapter and also complete the Google Form quiz for subtopic 8.3. I ask that you don't forget to check the rest of the classwork in Google Classroom. I will post more worksheet, especially for 8.3, to help you improve your understanding. And don't forget the tutorial questions as well. And that's all for me. Thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!